In the Soviet Union, signing another man's arrest warrant could secure your career. It could also become the reason for your own execution. Yakov Agranov spent much of his life inside the Soviet political police. He investigated alleged enemies of the revolution, helped build cases against intellectuals, engineers, former Bolsheviks, and political opponents, and took part in some of the most notorious repressive campaigns of the early Soviet state. He was not Stalin's closest associate, and he was not the single architect of the Great Terror, but he was one of the senior investigators and security officials who helped make that terror possible. Then, in 1937, the system turned against him. He was arrested by the state he had served. A year later, Yakov Agranov was executed. This is the story of a man who helped create the machinery of repression and who eventually became one of its victims. Yakov Agranov was born in 1893 in the Russian Empire into a Jewish family. His original name was Yankel Samuilovich Sorensen. Like many young radicals of his generation, he joined the revolutionary movement before the Bolsheviks took power. The old Russian Empire was marked by poverty, political repression, social inequality, and violence. For revolutionaries, the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917 seemed to promise a new world. But the new government quickly discovered that power could not be maintained through slogans alone. Civil war, famine, armed resistance, strikes, and political opposition created a climate of permanent emergency. In December 1917, the Bolsheviks established the Cheka, the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. Its task was simple in theory and terrifying in practice: to identify and eliminate enemies of the new state. Agranov entered the Cheka in 1919. He rose through the ranks because he was politically reliable, intelligent, ambitious, and willing to handle difficult political cases. Over time, the Cheka became the GPU, then the OGPU, and eventually part of the NKVD. The names changed, but the central mission remained: protect Communist Party rule by uncovering, or constructing, internal enemies. One of Agranov's early and most significant assignments came in 1921, after the Kronstadt rebellion. Kronstadt was a naval fortress near Petrograd, later renamed Leningrad. Its sailors had once been celebrated as supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution. But after years of civil war, food shortages, forced grain requisitions, economic collapse, and political repression, many sailors turned against the communist government. They demanded freer elections in the Soviets, political rights, and an end to one-party rule. The Bolshevik leadership treated the rebellion as an existential threat. Red Army forces crushed it, and the security services launched a broad campaign of investigation and punishment. Agranov was among the officers involved in the investigations that followed the rebellion. His work brought him into one of the most notorious early cases of Soviet political repression, the so-called Tagantsev conspiracy. The case was officially known as the Petrograd Military Organization. It was presented as a major anti-Bolshevik underground network, supposedly preparing a counter-revolutionary uprising. Agranov led the investigation into the alleged organization, which was associated with Vladimir Tagantsev, a prominent scholar. During the investigation, hundreds of people from Petrograd's intellectual, artistic, and academic circles were arrested. The most famous victim was Nikolai Gumilev, one of Russia's best-known poets and the former husband of the poet Anna Akhmatova. The case demonstrated a pattern that would become central to later Soviet repression. The secret police took scattered personal contacts, private opinions, attempted emigration, and vague political dissatisfaction, and turned them into evidence of a single organized conspiracy. Dozens of people were sentenced to death. Gumilev and Tagantsev were among those executed. In 1992, Russian prosecutors concluded that the case had been fabricated by the investigative authorities, although later archival debates complicated aspects of the story surrounding the alleged organization. What remains clear is that the investigation became a devastating instrument of political terror. Agranov's role in the Tagantsev case made him known as a specialist in political investigations, especially cases involving the old intelligentsia, writers, scholars, and former revolutionaries. During the late 1920s, the Soviet leadership faced enormous economic problems. Stalin's industrialization plans demanded rapid growth, but the country lacked modern equipment, experienced engineers, skilled workers, and reliable infrastructure. Production failures were common. Mines flooded, machines broke down, targets were missed. instead of treating these failures as problems of planning, resources, and unrealistic expectations. The regime increasingly explained them through conspiracy. The key word was wrecking. Engineers and specialists could be accused of deliberately damaging Soviet industry. A technical error could become sabotage. A missed production target could become treason. Agranov participated in the political investigations of this period, including cases directed against technical specialists. He was not the sole architect of these campaigns, but he was part of the security apparatus that helped build such cases. One of the most famous was the Shakti trial of 1928, in which engineers in the Donbas coal region were accused of sabotage and collaboration with foreign capitalist interests. The trial established an important principle of Stalinist repression. When the system failed, the regime could blame hidden enemies rather than admit structural mistakes. Confessions became especially important. They did not simply establish guilt. They created a public story, a story in which every industrial failure could be explained as the work of traitors. On December 1, 1934, Sergei Kirov was assassinated in Leningrad. Kirov was one of the most prominent Communist Party leaders in the Soviet Union. He was shot by Leonid Nikolaev inside the Smolny Institute, the headquarters of the Leningrad Party organization. The murder shocked the Soviet leadership, but it also gave Stalin a powerful political opportunity. Within hours, emergency legal measures were introduced. Investigations became faster. The rights of the accused were reduced. Executions could be carried out with extraordinary speed. Agranov traveled to Leningrad as part of the investigation. Historians still debate the full circumstances of Kirov's murder. There is no universal agreement on whether Stalin directly organized the assassination. But there is no serious doubt that Stalin used Kirov's death to expand repression against former oppositionists and suspected political enemies. Acting within a political process directed from the top, Agranov and other security officials helped transform the investigation into a weapon against alleged conspirators. The authorities did not stop with Nikolaev, the gunman. They arrested people connected to former opposition groups, especially those once associated with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. Under Stalinism, guilt was increasingly defined not by an individual act, but by association. You could be arrested because of a former friendship, a letter, a conversation, a political position you had abandoned years earlier. The Kirov case became one of the key steps on the road to the Great Terror. In the mid-1930s, Stalin's regime prepared a series of public show trials against former Bolshevik leaders. These trials were meant to prove that Stalin's former rivals were not simply political opponents. They were presented as terrorists, spies, wreckers, and agents of foreign powers. Agranov was involved in the security apparatus that prepared political cases against former oppositionists, including the networks associated with Zinoviev and Kamenev. In 1936, the first Moscow trial placed Zinoviev, Kamenev, and other old Bolsheviks in the dock. They confessed to extraordinary crimes, terrorism, conspiracy, and alleged collaboration with foreign intelligence services. The confessions were not evidence of a fair legal process. They were products of a political system based on pressure, isolation, threats, manipulation, and the destruction of any meaningful legal defense. Stalin needed more than the removal of his rivals. He needed public confessions. A confession turned political repression into a performance. It allowed the regime to claim that its victims had condemned themselves. In 1937, the Great Terror reached its most destructive phase. Under NKVD chief Nikolai Gumilev, arrests expanded across the Soviet Union. Former Bolsheviks, military officers, engineers, peasants, writers, ethnic minorities, clergy, and ordinary citizens were swept into mass operations. Agranov was a senior NKVD official, but his career was tied to Genrikh Yagoda, the previous head of the NKVD. That connection became dangerous. Stalin had removed Yagoda in 1936 and replaced him with Yezhov. In 1937, Yagoda himself was arrested and accused of treason, espionage, and conspiracy. The purge was now consuming not only those outside the system, but also the people who had helped run it. In May 1937, Agranov was removed from his position in Moscow and transferred to a lower-ranking role. In Stalin's Soviet Union, such a transfer could be a warning. Soon afterward, Agranov was arrested. The accusations against him followed a familiar pattern: anti-Soviet conspiracy, disloyalty, and association with enemies of the state. The investigator had become the accused. The man who had spent years participating in political investigations now faced the same system of accusation, coercion, and fear. On 1st of August 1938, Yakov Agranov was executed by shooting. He was 45 years old. His career had followed the rise of the Soviet secret police, from the early years of the Cheka to the terror of the NKVD. For nearly 2 decades, he had worked in institutions designed to defend the revolution through repression. But Stalinist terror could not remain limited to a fixed group of enemies. The system constantly needed new conspiracies, traitors, new confessions, and new targets. Eventually, it turned against many of the people who had helped to create it. Yakov Agranov was a victim of Stalin's purges, but he was not an innocent victim in the moral sense. He participated in the Soviet political police during some of its most formative and destructive years. He was involved in investigations that harmed intellectuals, political opponents, engineers, and former revolutionaries. He helped serve a system that treated suspicion as evidence and confession as proof. His own execution does not erase the suffering of the people caught in cases that he helped investigate, but his fate reveals something fundamental about dictatorship. A system built on fear cannot permanently protect even its most loyal servants. Once truth becomes secondary to political survival, no record of service is enough. Yesterday's investigator can become tomorrow's traitor. Yesterday's loyal official can become tomorrow's enemy of the people. Yakov Agranov helped build the machinery of Soviet terror. He took part in political investigations that helped normalize fabricated conspiracies, collective guilt, forced confessions, and the destruction of legal safeguards. Then, in 1937, the machinery turned against him. A year later, it killed him. His story is not only the story of one NKVD officer, it is the story of a system that demanded obedience, rewarded cruelty, and ultimately consumed many of the people who enforced its rule. Yakov Agranov was an investigator of Stalin's state. Then he became one more victim of Stalin's terror. If you found this video valuable, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.